This is House Corrections and Institutions. We are back. It is Thursday, January 16th. We have with us our state treasurer, Mike Pichek, with some of his staff. And he's going to be discussing the world of bonding and then how that plays into our capital budgeting. So welcome from.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Identify yourself for the record.
For sure. Mike Pichek, I'm the state treasurer. Pleasure to be here with you all. I wanted to introduce the team members I brought with me from the treasurer's office. And I was planning to give a broad overview of the topics discussed today, but I was also planning to hand it over to Scott Baker to walk through the actual presentation, but I'll be on hand if there are questions. But I want to start with Ashlyn Doyon, who's our director of policy. I don't know if you want to say anything, Ashlyn.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashlyn Doyon. As Treasurer Pichek mentioned, I'm the Director of Policy in the Treasurer's Office. I've been with the Treasurer's Office for going on 7 years now, so I have a
You
number.
were with Beth.
I was, yes, I have served under 2 treasurers, a number of legislative sessions under my belt at this point. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about this topic or any other work that the Treasurer's Office does. If I don't have the answer, I will find it for you.
You've had 2 great bosses.
I have. I've been very lucky.
And anything legislatively that you might need, please feel free to reach out to Ashlyn for that. And then I also wanted to introduce our CFO, Jeremiah Breer.
Hi, I'm Jeremiah Breer. I've worked at the Treasurer's Office for about 2.5 years. So I also have had 2 treasurers. I came in at the twilight of the Pierce administration, and Mike was kind enough to keep me along. And so I'm here for about 2.5 years.
And Scott Baker, who's really our director of everything, I would say. So.
Debt management.
And a lot more, but.
Yeah, thanks. So I've been with the treasury almost 14 years now, so I worked that hard back then, working on the bond issues for the state during that time, so. it's fine.
Thank you.
And with VHFA before that and finance for decades, really. So bring a lot of experience.
23 years, I think.
Well, and thank you all for having us in to talk about sort of our capital debt authorization. I'll talk a little bit about that process, but just thought maybe it'd be useful to just sort of talk a little bit about bonding in the treasurer's office generally. When I think about bonding, think about things that you would do in your personal finances that you are going to put on a long-term payment plan that are going to stand the test of time. So you would buy a mortgage on your house because you know that your house is going to be there for 30 years, you hope, and well beyond. You wouldn't necessarily put a 30-year mortgage on your car because you know your car is going to only last for a certain number of years.
The rate the car payments are going. Longer.
I need it.
Longer and longer.
But in the same way, in public financing, when you have something that you need to pay for that's going to be around for a generation or more, oftentimes you look to financing, which is in the state's case, bonding. Rather than paying upfront with cash or other kind of financing methods. So you also want to think about what are you financing? If it's something that has a short duration, it's not something that's really typically good to bond for. So in the past, there have been a lot of conversations around bonding for IT, for example, but IT's useful life is much shorter than a new roadside rest stop that you might be building, for example, or a new bridge or something of that nature. So just think it's useful to think about, what are the types of things that you bond for. When we actually go out and do bonding, it's quite a process where there's a lot of experts, both in the treasurer's office and outside of the treasurer's office, lawyers, financial advisors, people of that nature, broker dealers, that help us get a debt offering ready. If we're going to issue $1 million or $100 million in debt, we'll start that process, 4, 5, 6 months ahead of when we actually do the issuance. There's a lot of documentation. We got to work with the rating agencies to get our bonds rated so that we know what we can price them at in the public market. We decide how we're going to sell them, either through an open market or through a negotiated sale. And then as the day gets closer, we sort of really zoom in on what's happening with the market, whether we're still ready to go forward with the issuance. We get to the closing date or the sale date, we issue X amount of bonds, those in the capital markets funded those bonds, and the transaction closes usually within the next couple of weeks. So it's a pretty seamless process at this point. We generally issue debt once a year, although during the pandemic that got disrupted, both because of the pandemic, but also because there was a lot of money that came to the state of Vermont. So we could fund the various projects with money instead of with bonding. So for example, when I came into office, we had a debt issuance that next summer, so the summer of 2023, but I believe we hadn't had a debt offering maybe in close to 3 years, and definitely 2 years at that point. Yeah. So we got off a track a little bit, but generally we do this process once a year. That, usually sometime in the beginning or toward the end of the summer. And as a general matter, we have been working to pay down our outstanding debt over time. A lot of states have moved in the direction of paying as you go. So they have a cash fund and they'll pay for projects, even long-term projects, like I mentioned, a rest stop or a bridge, with cash instead of putting it, instead of bonding for it. So recognizing that other states are doing that, Treasurer Pierce was a big advocate of creating the cash fund, and there is a process in place for us to rely more on cash than on bonding over time. But all that being said, we have had an effort. You'll look on the slide, and I don't believe it's on an inflation adjusted basis, but on an inflation adjusted basis, our overall debt has been going down probably for close to a decade. We have about $600 million in total that's outstanding for the state of Vermont for our bonds. But another thing to keep in mind is those are the bonds that we're issuing. We think about other liability that the state has. A much more significant liability is the unfunded pension liability. Now we're making progress on that. We're very happy about the progress we've been making, and they're on track to be paid down by 2038 and 2048. But whereas the bonds are in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the outstanding pension liabilities in the billions of dollars, just to give you a sense of the scale. So this is really a critical thing in terms of the process we have for bonding, but more and more rating agencies are interested in what about that unfunded pension liability, not just in Vermont, but across the country. So it's something we have, front and center on our radar. And like I said, the good news is we're on a track to pay it down, and we've had 4 positive years of the pensions moving in the right direction after the pension reforms in 2022.
So the credit agencies do look at our pension viability.
Yeah, more and more. S&P is expressly incorporated into their
Plays into our credit rating.
Yes, for sure. When we look at the credit rating agencies, right, they'll look at Vermont's finances, and they're basically the third party entity that will say how likely is this state to pay back its bonds, like how strong is its economy, how strong is its workforce, how strong are its tax revenues, how well managed is the state, how much other debt do they have, just like you would with your personal credit score. So if you have a credit score of 850, you're AAA rated. If you're 500, you might be, junk status or something. I don't know. But, but it works in the same kind of scale if you want to think of it as a personal credit score. So we want to try to be at the AAA as best we can, because we will get lower interest rates on our debt when we do have to go out and bond for something. We'll pay less, taxpayers will pay less as a result of us having a higher rating, which means the credit rating agencies think we're more likely to pay it back than maybe another state, given that our economy is stronger, or we're better managed, or we have more reserves, or a whole host of reasons. But the rating agencies look at 2 primary things, to Vermont in terms of things that we need to improve. They look at unfunded pension liabilities, and then they look at our demographics for the state. And they're concerned about pension liabilities because if that grew too big, it would crowd out our ability to pay back our bonds. But like I said, we've made progress, and the rating agencies have acknowledged the progress we're making on our pension liabilities. So we need to keep that up. And then on demographics, what they're worried about is that your workforce would get smaller, your economy would get smaller, your revenues into the state of Vermont would get smaller. And then, you just don't have as much revenue to pay for all the things that you need to pay for. And then you become less likely to pay back your debt. Just again, like in your personal life, if some reason you had revenue, your personal revenue was cut off, you couldn't pay your credit card bill anymore. You had to pay for the other things that you have to pay for to run your life. Again, good progress on that too. We've had growing population, younger people as well as evidence of that. So rating agencies have recognized the progress Vermont has made on that as well.
We do have some questions.
Yeah.
It's an unfair question, Mike,
Yeah.
but it's back to back with the previous testimony here. Not looking for numbers, just any thoughts on, we can't staff a prison if our lives depended on it. And one of the options floated was move correctional officers into the law enforcement plan there. And just general thoughts on what weight that would put on the system or, yeah,
So was it like 300 correctional officers? Does that sound right?
it's quite a bit more, yeah.
We have about, what, 800?
800? So it's not an insignificant number, so, the way to think about it is, both in terms of the credit that, law enforcement has a faster way to get to a full retirement, although now corrections officers are in something called Group G, which mimics the time commitment to get to full pension. But if the benefits are more robust and they haven't been paid into the system, and you have people that are going to get full credit, so if you're talking about a go forward basis, or if you're talking about bringing people in without acknowledging sort of a fresh start, I guess that's one question. And then on a fresh start perspective, you just would have to make sure that the employer is contributing enough money into the system so that it's staying revenue neutral, which could be a budgetary impact on the state of Vermont. But we look at different things like that with some regularity. So if the conversation advances further, we're happy to look at it more.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah.
So what is our credit score now? What is the credit?
Yeah. So in all three of them, they rate them a little bit differently, but we're AA plus, which is basically the highest other than AAA. So we are the strongest, we are one notch below AAA status on all three of the major credit rating reports. And we're, I believe, still the highest in New England. I think that's still true. Some of the New England states have been improving their credit scores recently. We've always been relatively high. I mentioned the things that the rating agencies look at that they want us to improve, but they also recognize that the state has been well managed from a financial standpoint for a long time, that from a political standpoint, we present balanced budgets. We work well together between the legislature and the governor. So just good fiscal management is always something that we rank really highly on. We have strong reserving practices. We have strong things like the CDAC, which we'll talk about, strong processes in place for issuing debt and making sure we don't issue too much debt. So we get a lot of good favorability on that. We get recognized for our strong, for our small size, strong tourism economy, strong economy, overall that is growing with outdoor recreation and other opportunities like that. So
one thing too that's really important about how our state is rated by the credit agency not only helps the state, but it helps our municipalities
yes,
and our school districts when they go out to bond because of our credit rating is so high, they can go out to bond at a lower cost.
that's exactly right.
It's not just the state that benefits, it's also our towns and school districts.
So there's some, instrumentalities of the state government called like the Vermont Economic Development Authority, VEDA, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, the Vermont Bond Bank, and the Vermont Student Assistant Corporation. They're probably the four that I would call out. And all of them have in the past or do regularly issue bonds on their own from their own, balance sheet, if you will, but there's a moral obligation for the state of Vermont to step in if something were to happen with that organization. So they rely to a degree on the strength of our credit report when they're issuing their own debt. So the bond bank issues the debt for a lot of the municipalities and school districts and things that basically can't do it economically on their own. They aggregate those bond issuances and then issue them as a collective, which is a great program that we have in Vermont. The Vermont Student Assistant Corporation regularly issues bonds. They do it once a year. VEDA is less regular, but the Vermont Housing Finance Agency very well may as well. So it's important for those in economic development and housing, student loans, and then municipalities, as the chair points out. So taxpayers rely on this rating in a number of ways.
And can you talk about the difference between moral obligation and
Yeah.
full faith and credit? Because when we bond for the capital bill, it's full faith and credit.
Yeah. So the debt that we issue is called general obligation GO bonds. So the state of Vermont has a legal obligation to pay for those bonds, and pay those bondholders back. The moral obligation is, there may not very well be a legal requirement, but it's fully expected that the state of Vermont would step in and cover those bonds if something happened with those institutions. And if we did not do that, it would significantly damage our reputation and ability to support those organizations in the future. So it's more of a moral obligation, as the name connotes than a legal obligation as it would be under the general obligation bonds. And I will say the other thing, we did do our bond issuance this past year.
When was the when did we do?
I think it closed in September 2020.
June 24th.
And how much was it for?
Well, we did a new issue, about $76 million. There was premium in there, so we had about $79 million of new, projects for new money for projects. And then we did a refunding issue for $37 million, which is basically like refinancing your mortgage. We, refinanced some older bonds. And that created about 3.7 million of net present value savings from bonds that we had already issued. So basically lowering our borrowing costs. So total, they were over 100 million, but it was only $76 million of new bonds.
So are we getting a bond premium this year? At all?
It was about a 6.9 million premium. Yeah. So I'm not sure.
So we had 5 million last time. So we had 5 million last time.
Yeah.
How much debt did we issue last?
The previous one, I think it was about 90 million.
It was more.
95 million of new money. Yeah.
The one thing I'll say on the rate that the state of Vermont received, which I think is worth pointing out, even though it's not worth making the case to the credit rating agencies, is that we were getting a rate as if we were a AAA rated state, even though we're AA plus. So a lot of the AAA rated states were paying the same interest as us that went out in the market around the same time that we did. So I think it's a testament to the market saying Vermont is a strong bet. Although, of course, we also issue debt less frequently than other states. So there might be a premium on the uniqueness of Vermont actually going out and issuing debt and them able to diversify their portfolio.
Kevin?
I hear the term all the time. I have to admit, I don't know what unfunded pension liability
Yeah.
is.
So if you think of it, if it was just you by yourself, and we made an estimate that I was going to pay for your retirement and you've earned $70,000 a year. And if we make an expectation that you're going to live X number of years and we say we really need about $1 million in the bank to be able to pay for your pension, your retirement, I'd send you that 75,000 every year, regardless if you lived one more year or you live 50 more years. So that's the pension. It's that concept of, you've earned that benefit for the rest of your life. You can't take that $1 million and buy a house with it. Like you get it in sort of your regular. Yeah. And then there's also a healthcare that's called other post-employment benefits, which is basically healthcare that state employees and teachers receive, which is critically important to retirees. So that's another part of the pension system. We refer to it colloquially as pensions, but it's that pension and that healthcare. So if I say I have $1 million, I know that I'm going to have $1 million to pay for your expenses in the future. I don't need to have maybe all of that $1 million because I'm going to be earning money in the market along the way. But let's just say it was $1 million, but I only have $500,000 right now. So I know my liabilities are $1 million, but my assets are $500,000. So that would be a $500,000 pension liability that I would need to close and try to get to $1 million. And that's what the state of Vermont's working on. We had pension reform about 2.5 years ago. The pension, that liability, that difference, it was like $1,500,000, but then it was $1,400,000. It was growing in the wrong direction. Now we've got it back going in the right direction, and that gap is closing. We had to put more money into the system every year to get it up to fully funded. But essentially that's the unfunded liability.
Okay. And the obvious question is why do we have any?
Yeah, a lot of reasons. And one big one recently was 2008, the financial crisis. Yeah. But also if you're not putting enough money in over time, then your funding liability can, and if you think you're going to earn more than you do on your returns, that's another big one.
I fully understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yep.
Regarding that double A plus, I think I'm saying that right, rating, and you said there were a few things that we could do to get to a AAA
Yeah.
rating. What would that be? How long would that process entail? And are you working on that? Yeah.
So one of the treasurer's responsibilities is to have the relationship with the credit rating agencies. And what could we do is, my opinion, build more housing. Like that's the thing that we really need. We need more people in Vermont. We need more taxpayers. We need more people in our workforce. We need people in our workforce to replace those that are retiring. We can't do any of those things. if We don't build more housing. So that's why we've been in our office so focused on housing and supporting the creation of new housings. I think that's our number one economic issue. When I first became treasurer, we invited the rating agencies up to Vermont to give a day and a half tour of our economy. Basically, we had a conversation up at Hula in Burlington about this sort of venture capital market place that's developed. We spent the late morning in South Burlington to talk about housing because there's been a lot of housing development in South Burlington and some employer-sponsored housing. We spent the afternoon at Beta to talk about some of the manufacturing that's going on in Vermont. We spent the late afternoon talking about Vermont's outdoor recreation economy and our natural beauty and some of our energy initiatives. So we try to make the case to the rating agencies that we are, a strong state and with a strong economy we're making strategic investments in, that it's worthy of a AAA status, but that process to work back to AAA takes some time after they've downgraded a state. And the downgrade was like 2017. Does that sound right? 18?
Well, I guess just following up on that, the reason I asked that was because you had said that we still get the same interest rate.
In this most recent issuance we did, yeah. No, it might not always be the case.
Right, and that's what I was gonna say is, would it even make sense to try and get to achieve AAA at that rate? Like, I don't know,
I think it does. I think it would, only because by working to achieve that, we're also working to fix our underlying economic issues, which is things like housing, making sure our pension liabilities are paid down. So demographics, pension liabilities, if those are two good public policy things to focus on. And as a result, we would get back to AAA. So there's multiple reasons to focus on those issues, in my opinion.
and then to kind of turn it back to you,
Oh,
Chair,
wow.
I will say, because this rating does affect how much we can take for the capital bill, like how much bonding capacity we have, right? Or
It sort of plays into it, but there's other factors that go into what determines our bonding capacity for the year. And that's something I do want to get
Yeah.
into, and that's through the debt affordability
Yeah.
committee, and they look at different factors. So before we get there, we do have another.
Oh, yeah.
Just one more, Treasurer.
Yeah.
Who are the financial institutions that we go to for bonding?
Like who handles that for us?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Curious.
Morgan Stanley has traditionally been our broker on the negotiated transaction side. So we do something called like a citizen bond, where Vermont citizens can buy state of Vermont bonds, and that's traditionally done through Morgan Stanley. When we do the open market process, another good sign I think for Vermont is, if I remember correctly, we had over 10 bidders a couple of years ago, and maybe even more. So a lot of people interested. Who did we land on last year?
Piper.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the last issue was all competitive.
Yeah. So we didn't, the citizen bonds are great, but less, 1 or 2% of Vermonters, of the amount of bonds that we issue, it's a very small percentage actually buy. So this most recent issuance, we did all market and didn't do any negotiated, and and I think at least I made a commitment to, we'll probably split that every other year. We'll probably do a citizen bond. So we have the opportunity for Vermonters to buy Vermont bonds, even if it is not a large percentage, because it tends to be a little bit more expensive to do that process.
Kevin.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll take,
You gotta go.
yeah.
Just real quick. I haven't paid off my mortgage because I can make more in the market.
Yeah,
Why do we bond?
yeah.
Because we can't come up with the cash, or because we want to? Why do we bond it?
Yeah.
as a state?
It's usually for the exact reason you're saying, there's not enough cash right now to pay for the $100 million XYZ project.
All right.
But that's the thing I was talking about, the cash fund that states are developing. So they're moving toward paying with more things with cash. Other states are doing that. We have it in Vermont now, and it'll build up over time. It'll take us some time till we get to a point where we're relying more consistently solely on something like a cash fund. But but other states are moving that direction.
But it is a target.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, if you can, in a perfect world, you wouldn't pay any interest rate if you have access to all the cash that you needed, in the current moment.
Your home,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, if you had all the money that you needed, you wouldn't have to have a mortgage, right? Necessarily, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, I could pay it off, but I choose not to because I can make more mark.
Right.
I just didn't know whether that was applicable to the state.
well, in some ways, I mean, we were appropriated $20 million 4 years ago to buy off our state bonds, or $20 million of our state bonds. And we've been earning like 5.25% on that money, and we've been paying out, I don't know, let's call it like 1.5 to 2% in interest. So we haven't bought the bonds down because we're earning more money at this moment on that cash.
So
So there-
it's a similar principle.
So there are times where we manage our cash depending on the market.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Scott Baker is going to take over and run through the report.
Oh,
Thank you, Treasurer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
we'll have you back, I'm sure.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Great.
Welcome, Scott.
Thank you.
Been before us.
Yeah. Glad to be back again. Thank you. Scott Baker from the Treasurer's Office. So Mike mentioned when we do a bond issue, so this is the offering statement from our last bond issue. So he said it takes a while to put together. This is why. So anyways, so we're here to talk about bonding capacity and how we come up with the amount of recommended authorization. So the first slide. So it all starts with CDAC, the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee. And that committee is made up of the state treasurer who chairs the committee, the Secretary of Administration, a representative from the Vermont Bond Bank. The governor has 2 appointees, the treasurer has an appointee, and there are 2 non-voting members on the committee, the state auditor and the legislative economist, who's the JFO designate. But it could be it happens to be the legislative economist, but it could be anybody from that JFO designates. So there are a lot of states conduct debt affordability studies, as Vermont does. And you can see in the chart, the states that do. CDAC actually over the last couple of years has looked at a lot of the other states to see what they do to, make sure they're doing best practices and getting different ideas. So that's something they really focus on too. But this is something, having CDAC is important. Have somebody independent looking at those debt affordability metrics and seeing what can prudently be issued. And the rating agencies really give us a lot of credit for that.
Are you going to go into those metrics at all?
Yes.
Okay.
For sure.
That's,
Then why doesn't,
Mhm.
I don't see the shading for Florida, Kansas, or Kentucky. Curious why, does that?
that affordability study.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, not all states have a process where they go through debt affordability. They have a process to issue debt, but they may not go through, the specific debt affordability study. Let's do that. Sure. So talking about what CDAC is, CDAC was created in statute in 1989, and their responsibility is to look at, determine how much debt that Vermont can prudently issue each year. They look at the amount of bonds outstanding, moral obligation, as Mike mentioned, and they issue a report. And this is this year's report. They issue by September 30th of each year. They send it to the governor and the legislator. This is posted on the treasurer's website. But it basically goes through the process, everything CDAC is reviewing. And it's to recommend the amount of net tax supported debt that the state can issue. And we'll talk about exactly what net tax supported debt is later on. They, starting in 2012, they started doing a biennial recommendation. So the recommendation for this year is for the 26-27 biennium. Before that, it was an annual. They still meet annually, and they may revise, in the interim year, but it is a 2-year recommendation that they come out with at first. As the name mentioned, it is an advisory committee. You know, that amount has always gone into the capital bill and the legislature has always followed that amount. And that's something that, you know, the rating agencies cite in their report. That, you know, there's an agreement and they've always stuck to that amount. But again, it is an advisory. It's not a strict amount. So some of the things that they consider, again, look at the amount of debt that's outstanding, amount of authorized but unissued, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. That's been one of the main topics of conversation for CDAC for the last few years. They also do projections of debt issuance for the next 10 years and look at the metrics out for 10 years. They look at debt service requirements. They look at basically what the rating agencies are looking at, the criteria that they're focusing on. And again, the trying to keep the high credit ratings to keep the borrowing costs down. So that's the rating agency credit reports are an important thing. So we, you know, look at their methodology and try to follow that among some other things. And also looking at the moral obligation that the state has and capital needs of the state to a degree. It's mostly up to your committee to decide what projects, you know, that money goes to. CDAC is basically looking at the amount that could be issued, not specifically what projects that they should be directed to.
Before you leave that, I think what's important is number one, authorized but unissued. So if you look at our spreadsheet, we have a lot that's been authorized there. And what they look at is they'll go to the different departments or agencies to find out how far along they are in expending what's been authorized. And there has been times that, and I think BGS alluded to this this morning, when Irene hit and the focus was all hands on deck to rebuild the Waterbury complex, that the major maintenance amount that had been authorized by the capital bill and the budget had not gone out in a few years, and it was just sitting there. That's what they look at, and they can make a recommendation to say, we're not going to increase your bonding capacity because you have so many projects that have been authorized, but the dollars haven't gone out the door because the project hasn't proceeded. So that's what that means, authorized but unissued amount. So we authorize it in the capital bill, been authorized. But sometimes the project doesn't go forward and just kind of sits there.
Right. So when we do a bond issue, we will survey the departments and look at the projects and say, okay, how much have you spent? How much are you going to spend in the next 12 months? Because we will do an issue every year. And that's the amount that we'll bond for. So if a project is appropriated $2 million and they're only going to spend $1 million, we're only going to bond for $1 million. So there's another $1 million that's authorized, that you've authorized, but we haven't issued it yet. So that's unbonded for. And that amount has grown, and we have a chart that will talk about that.
That the authorized but unissued amount has grown.
Right.
And is that in a particular department or agency that you're seeing it, or is it across the board? Bill.
Yeah, it's kind of across the board. I mean, a lot of it, you know, there were so many federal dollars coming in and, you know, during COVID, projects just weren't spending the money that they were authorized in a lot of areas. You
And
know.
part of the reason for that was there was strings attached to the money coming in on ARPA, on COVID money in particular, that had to be encumbered by a certain date. And then the project has to be completed and all the bills signed off by a certain date. So that kind of took priority.
Right. And we don't want to issue bonds if we know the money's not going to be spent, because when we issue a bond, they're tax exempt bonds, which means the bondholders don't pay tax on the interest that we pay them. And there are a lot of tax rules around that. Once we issue the money, we only have a certain amount of time to spend that money. And the other reason is we don't want to borrow at a certain cost and just sit on it, pay interest and earn less than it's costing us, so. Okay. So, benchmark. So there are three primary rating agencies, Fitch, S&P, and Moody's, that assign credit ratings to the state. I know Mike talked about this a little bit. AAA is the highest, and again, the higher credit rating, the lower your borrowing cost. So because we strive to be a AAA state, and again, Moody's, we had a AAA rating and Fitch up until 2018. We lost our AAA rating in 2018 on both of those, and basically because of the demographics, small state economy and the long-term liabilities, the pension and OPEB liabilities. But the goal is to get back to a AAA. So when CDAC does their benchmark of the debt metrics, we want to compare ourselves to AAA rated states. So we look at the debt metrics for other states with at least 2 AAA ratings, 2 out of the 3. And so this past year, there were 17 states. Again, there were 2 of them that only had 2 AAAs, but so this shows the benchmark of the states that we're looking at. One of the first debt metrics that we look at is debt per capita. This chart shows over the last 5 years, where those states are debt per capita. You can see Vermont has about the 6th highest debt per capita rating. So this is one that this is a metric that, because we're a small state, it's tough for us to compete. The population is small, and we understand that we're a little bit high in that category. It's one of the metrics that the rating agency looks at, but it's not the most important one that they look at. So,
Ask how you define capita per
population, right?
population.
Right. So it's
Is that
basic.
college students?
The state.
They vote.
But
Wouldn't wouldn't it really go by the census that's done?
Yeah. It's whoever's included in the census.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're at 650,000 thereabouts.
Well,
I have a question real quick. I actually kind of want to understand more. Are you talking about like the debt that the legislature has, and like what, or like state's debt? I guess I'm just wanting to know.
So net tax supported debt. So predominantly the general obligation bonds that the state has, but there are a couple other things that, leases go into that, which small amount, but the majority of it is the general obligation bonds that we've issued. So the next chart just shows where we compare. This is the median of all 50 states, not just the AAA rated states, but you can see the blue line is the median of the 50 states, debt per capita, and the green is Vermont. You can see for several years we were quite a bit below the 50 state median. And as other states have kind of cut down on the debt that they've issued, and their population has grown, Vermont's population has kind of stayed steady, so we're kind of closed in and somewhat above the median for a couple of years there. Right now, we're just below it, within, very close to the median, pretty much right there. So, but this shows the 50 states. The next debt metrics that we look at is debt as a percentage of personal income. And again, this chart compares us to the AAA states. See, we're kind of not quite in the middle. We're a little bit high on the higher side, 1.9% debt as a percentage of personal income. And what this metric does is kind of indicates the taxpayer's ability to handle debt because it's based on personal income. And the next chart will just show where we compare in that metric compared to the 50 states. Again, we're kind of right, just slightly below the 50 state median. And again, you know, we were well below, but as other states have lowered their debt and our other populations have increased, ours has remained pretty steady. Those have kind of closed in. The next chart shows those two metrics, debt per capita and debt as a percent of personal income, where we rank among the 50 states. And so this year we're 25th, so we're kind of right in the middle. Again, as you can see from those charts, the higher number is better number. So, you know, you can see back in 2011, 12 area, we were, you know, 37, 36. So we're kind of in the top. So it kind of correlates with those charts that we saw, but you can see our ranking has declined somewhat, but we're still kind of right in the middle of the pack among the 50 states. The next metric that we look at, this shows debt as a percent of gross domestic product. We've always measured debt as a percent of revenue, which is almost the same thing. It's slightly different. So we're not on here, but our debt as a percent of revenue is 3.7%. So you would see where we would fall kind of near the top, but this is based on state revenue, so it's more of an indicator of the ability of the state to pay its debt, whereas the personal income is based on the taxpayer's ability. So these are some of the metrics that these are the three metrics that traditionally CDAC has looked at and pegged, and you'll see a chart how they set guidelines. So this shows where we are in bond ratings. Again, the three credit rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. The highest is AAA on all of them. We are one notch below, AA+ for S&P and Fitch, AA1 Moody's. It's basically the same thing, slightly different. They express it slightly different, that's all. We did our bond issue in June. So we went to the rating agencies. Every time we do a bond issue, we get a credit rating. We go to them and have meetings with them and go through all our budget and finance and do all that, and they issue a credit report. So the latest ratings were issued in May, the end of May and June. And again, that's the second highest. And so just to give you an idea, what it means, as Mike mentioned, we went to market in June, the same time within a day or so of a couple AAA rated states. And some of them were off a day, so the market may change from one day to the next, but our interest rates were basically we were paying through the other states. So we were paying even slightly less than some of the bigger states. Part of it is they had bigger issues, so there was more to sell. But Vermont paper is traditionally, there's a lot of demand and not a lot of supply. So that helps us too. But maintaining the high rating is very important. This last issue that we did on 20-year bonds, we had a borrowing cost of 3.5%. Back in 21, we did the issue. Our all-in bond cost is 1.4%. So just incredible rates. It's hard to borrow, hard to get much better than that. So
it's interesting to read the rating agencies' commentaries about what our strengths are and where our challenges are. It's really well worth reading, spending time reading that.
Yeah.
It's a track record of disciplined financial management, strong budget management framework with history of effective budgeting. Although the state's economy is the smallest of all U.S. states, resident income is above average, which kind of surprises me. Educational attainment is high and unemployment is low. It's just interesting to read that. Just sort of don't think about that. Though the challenges are a weak labor force, which will weigh on long-term economic growth, our pension liabilities.
Yeah, we've always, we have basically on governance, budget. We get high marks for that, and that's kind of what gets us up to a high rating. Just, you know, the CDAC process, the high liquidity, good reserve funds, all of that are strengths to us. And again, the reason we lost our AAA in 2018, the demographics, you know, just an aging population and the long-term liabilities, the pension and OPEB liabilities. But because of the pension reform 2 years ago, you know, those they did note those in their reports this time, especially Fitch, you know, made note of that and basically saying we're on the right path to get there.
I liked what Fitch said. Elected leaders maintain close oversight and management of debt issuance and have engaged in multiple efforts to improve the sustainability of retirement liabilities over time. I'm sure you don't see something like that about elected folks. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, so,
Because another, yeah.
Well, not me, it's the whole body, what we did a few years ago, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, again, it's, you know, the whole financial oversight and the pension reform and legislative process. Yeah, I mean, that's important and they have noted that, so.
That gets lost. That information gets lost.
Yeah. Okay, so some of the recommendations, again, with, you know, because of other states lowering their debt loads, debt ratios declining a little bit over time. CDAC spent a lot of time over the last couple of years just looking at discussing the volatility, the economics, the supply chain issues, the fact that there's so much federal money, the, you know, projects aren't being built because there's competition to get projects built. There are only so many trade workers out there. Everybody's competing for the same thing, high inflation, just a bunch of many factors went into it. The high authorized but unissued amount. They came up with a 26-27 biennium recommendation of 100 million, which is a further reduction from the last time. But they did, because of these many factors, they did say in the interim, they meet every year anyways, and they haven't changed their interim recommendation, but because of these factors and if things change in the interim, they may update it.
So the bottom part, which you don't see on the screen, says potential of increase in the second year of the biennial recommendations, given the factors above. So what that means is right now, what the recommendation is for our bonding capacity for FY 26 and 27 is 100 million. 50 first year, 50 the second year. And then come August or September of this coming year, the Affordability Committee will reconvene and look at what we've done for the capital bill, look at what projects have gone out in the interim, and take in these other factors as well, and then revisit, should it be 50 million for FY 27, or should it be increased, or should it be decreased?
I believe they said they wouldn't decrease it, but they may increase it. Is that correct?
Can I ask one other question, Troy? How much is the cash?
You're the chair.
No, how much is the cash fund playing into this recommendation?
They're not supposed to.
I know they're not
Cash fund.
supposed to. We were clear about that.
Right. Yeah, and their focus is basically looking at the debt affordability metrics and not so much what's available. So.
Can I just get a couple of examples of what we might decide this year that would have that impact? Saying, okay, we've looked at what you bonded for 2026. We're gonna increase for that second year. Like, are they looking at I'll leave it open-ended.
Um,
Like, is there a high risk bond that would have an impact on that?
so I'm not on the committee, but I will try to.
Yeah,
I think they're, are you talking about what may change their
yeah,
recommendation?
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's based on a lot of these unknown factors that, a lot of it, because they're so much authorized but unissued, I mean, they could say $200 million.
Right,
And if
okay.
projects aren't going to be, if you can't spend the money, there's no sense in authorizing that much amount. But if some of these things change, if labor, there's more labor available, you're getting projects done, you're not competing with the towns that are trying to, recover from flooding, and
Yeah.
there are just so many factors that went into it this year that I think they're going to look at it again next year and maybe change that, but.
Okay.
Yeah, just following up on the chair's question there. The administration recommends like a certain percentage of the general fund be used for the cash fund, as we look at the full capital bill. Does the treasurer's office have any recommendations on that, a hard number or?
I can take that.
Yeah.
I think when we all worked together to put in place the cash fund language, the original percentage, which I think was 4%, right? We had sort of all arrived at together. The cash fund, I would say, was really kind of the brainchild of former Treasurer Pierce. Any percentages going forward or changes to that allocation, we've not really been the leaders in that conversation.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
The legislature was in the driver's. That's what she's saying.
So the next slide, the debt metrics projections. So what this shows us, these are the three debt metrics that we discussed so far: the debt per capita, debt as a percent of personal income, and debt service as a percent of revenue. And the top of the chart shows the last 10 years. And the bottom of the chart shows projections for the next 10 years. As I mentioned, in statute, it calls for CDAC to do 10-year debt projections. And they set guidelines. So you can see the bottom of the chart, the first column, debt per capita. They set the state guideline at the 5-year average of the AAA rated states medians. And that's what shows under the state guideline. The part in shaded is where at current debt issuance for the state, if we continue at the same level, that's where we will be. And it's shaded because it shows that we will be out of compliance with the state guideline. And as I mentioned before, debt per capita is one of the metrics that they look at, but it's kind of the less important. It's one that although the rating agencies look at it, it's not the one they focus on the most. And we're kind of at a disadvantage because of the small population again. So even though we're out of compliance with the state guideline there, they acknowledge that. But the other two, debt as a percent of personal income, they set the state guideline at 1.8%, and that's kind of a volatile number. They look at the AAA rated states median for that. Over the last 5 years, that number for the AAAs have ranged from 1.3 to 1.9. So it's kind of a volatile number. So they kind of set the state guideline at 1.8%. And as you can see, so when they do the projections, they look at many scenarios. If we issue this much debt, if we issue this much, and they'll go through all those projections and say, okay, if we do that, where will our debt metrics end up? So this chart shows at 50 million per year or 100 over the 2 years, where will we be in 10 years if we issue those amounts? And that's where our projections will line up. So we'll be within compliance of that state guideline. And again, the last column, debt service as a percent of revenues, they set the guideline at 4%. That was actually lowered this year. It was 6% in the past. But with the growth in the revenue in the general fund and the transportation fund over the last several years, that's kind of come down. I think the highest it's been was 4.7% back in 2012. So it's really tapered off since then. So they felt comfortable in lowering the guideline. But again, so these are the projections of showing at 50 million per year where we will be. And that's one of that's like the basic of how they get to the debt authorization, is looking at these debt metrics and saying, you know, we want to be a AAA rated state. The rating agencies are going to run these metrics. Where do we want to be?
Is that debt per capita in nominal dollars? It appears as though it is.
How it's going up? Yeah.
Compared to the other two charts, it's implied that it is.
Yeah. So what that is, it's projected at a 2.7% increase each year. So just a 2.7% inflator every year. That's why it's going up for the state median, for the AAA medians. And the Vermont numbers are based on continued issuance of 50 million every year. So it's taking into account what Vermont issues and what's rolling off, you know, what we're paying off. So the debt amount is changing. We have population, as a state economist does population projections. So it's based on that. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, basically. Yeah.
Basically, what it's,
I had read over there.
I know it's small
sorry.
writing, but yeah, no, it's,
basically what it's saying is if we stay at 50 million for the next 10 years, our debt per capita will go from 1,117 down to 914.
right. Right, because even though we're issuing,
Debt,
right,
you're
exactly.
not increasing the amount of new debt that you're keeping at the same level of 50 million.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's discussion about, you know, because you have to do 10-year projections, you keep it at 50 million, but, you know, it's hard to know where you'll be 5 years from now, how much you're going to issue, so.
Do the debt agencies also look at our infrastructure needs? Not necessarily the projects that are out there, but our infrastructure needs, and they want to make sure that we're maintaining our infrastructure.
Yeah, definitely, and that is more of a focus now, and that's something that CDAC is looking at, especially last year. This year, they spent quite a bit of time talking about that. There's a capital depreciation ratio they're looking at, and there's a lot of discussion in the report about that and how they're looking at that. So, yeah, it's definitely something they're paying attention to. States with a lot of deferred maintenance, you know, they're paying attention to that because they may not be issuing debt, but they're not taking care of what they need to do as well. So, yeah. So the next slide, just kind of a dashboard indicator of some of those metrics compared to the AAA rated states. The only different thing on here, the debt retirement, the rapidity of debt retirement shows how much our debt will be paying down in the next 5, 10, 15, and 20 years. So by statute, when we issue GO bonds, we're limited to 20-year bonds, and they're level principal payments. So where you have a mortgage and you're paying the same amount every year, your principal is this much and your interest, and your principal keeps going up. When we issue bonds, our principal amount is equal every year, so we're paying less every year. So our interest is going down, and that's by statute. It has to be in level or diminishing principal amounts. So that's why it's good. And that's another thing that the rating agencies pay attention to, is our rapid amortization of debt. We're not, you know, we're paying our principal down quickly. So.
Because up front, we're paying more of the principal, when normally you'd be paying more of the interest than your principal.
Right. So your payments, your total payments are higher to begin with, and they go down, but it's because you're paying the full amount of principal every time, and your interest is going down. So. And then the next few charts, this one shows the debt authorizations back from 2000. And you can see kind of the 2015-16 was the high mark. That was 159.9 million for the biennium. Before 2012, it was an annual recommendation. Started in 2012, CDAC moved to a biennium recommendation. And just for simplicity, I know the capital bill's not exactly equal every year, but this just splits them evenly between the 2 years. And so the green is the amount of authorization that's been through the years, and the 2 yellow is basically the recommended amount this year.
So back in 2000, 2001 and 2, you could buy a lot more with 34, 39 million than you can with 50 or 60 million now.
Yeah, and I didn't include this, but we have in the past, sometimes the inflation adjusted, and it's
We had a member
Very
who was
different.
really concerned about that.
yes, yeah.
In the inflation adjustment number, so you could really compare. And this gives you a kind of a comparison, but you could get more bang for your buck
Yeah, you could.
20 years ago.
But you know what factor is that cash piece came in later, right? It didn't exist in 2001?
Correct. Cash has only been in existence for 2 years.
Yes. Yeah, so there's that. It's a mitigating factor of some sort.
It is, depending what happens to our general fund budget.
Especially if we can get that number, which you attempted to
There's a lot of
earlier.
money out there, and if in this building, if people know there's a pot of money,
Well, don't tell them.
it can get rated.
It's like friends.
Hmm?
It's like a feeding frenzy.
Yeah, they know there's a pot of money.
Not us, right? Just everybody else.
Yeah.
Well, we won't in this, once it gets over in the other body, changes.
Yeah.
Once it gets on the floor of the house, it change.
So the next chart just shows the amount of debt outstanding. And again, this isn't inflation adjusted. If it was, it would be much more level. But you can see it's going to come down a little. Bless you. 23 looks much lower than 24, only because we did an issue in September of 23 and one in June of 24. So they're kind of both fell within the same fiscal year. So it's a little, skewed, but anyway, so this shows the amount of debt outstanding in a little over 600 million of net tax supported debt.
You said this is not adjusted for inflation.
Correct, right. These are real numbers. The next chart it's kind of the same thing. It shows by biennium the amount authorized but unissued, amount authorized and amount of bonds that we issued. But I just wanted to show this because that green stripe chart shows the amount of authorized but unissued debt. And you could see, starting in, really 2015, projects weren't, the money just wasn't going out the door as much as it was authorized. And you can see how much the authorized but unissued amount has grown over the years. And that's one of the factors in, the amount that CDAC has come up with, so.
And this comes from, so when you're looking at the 3 bars there for 24, 25, and it talks about amount authorized but unissued is 150 million. That incorporates previous years as well, right? It's not just limited to what's in 24, 20.
Yeah, that's cumulative, right?
It's what's accumulated. So if you look in 22, 23, there was 185. So part of that 150 may be coming from that 185.
Yeah, so just so you know, so this last issue that we did in June, these finance projects from capital bills from 22, 23, back to 2015, 16, 17. So some of this has been around for a long time. The money was authorized, but just wasn't spent. So we're finally getting.
So that ties into the repo committee, because they have to make a case. We have, by statute, we put in, if the money is, help me, Troy and Mary, if the money is more than 2 years old,
That's what we
Yes.
look at.
that's what we look at.
That's what we ask them to make a case for.
Right.
And we can bring that back to the capital bill if they don't make a good case. Money's been out there for two fiscal years or more. So this year, you're gonna start looking at the 23.
Yes,
And then we've seen stuff, I remember 2019, you remember further back than
I
that.
remember something in 2014, but I think we took it.
Yeah,
But they have to make the case that they're gonna go out. So this bond issuance that went out this past June may incorporate some of those projects you looked at last year for repo that you did not reallocate. And hopefully, some of those projects were in this last bondage issuance.
So the next chart just shows what makes up the net tax supported debt of the state. Again, 600 million of general obligation bonds. And as Mike mentioned, that's general obligation means payable from any state revenue. It's full faith and credit of the state behind that. So if the state has cash, we need to pay it. There's about 27 million of this is the housing bonds. VHFA issued a bond in 2018 and that's paid for. So in each fiscal year, the first $2.5 million of property transfer tax receipts gets transferred to VHFA to pay the debt service on these bonds. And way back when we did it, we were trying to, there was a housing bond being developed and we were trying to not have it show up as the state's net tax supported debt, but because it's a state revenue, the rating agencies are looking at it as net tax supported debt of the state. So it's on there.
So sometimes if you have a bond that has a revenue dedicated to paying off that bond, sometimes it does not show up on the net tax supported debt. We did that with transportation. We had a dedicated revenue source to pay off their, I can't remember what it was called.
Yeah, so the transportation infrastructure bonds, we had 3 issues in 10, 12, and 13, and we issued total about $37 million. And the money went into the transportation fund. And there was a motor fuel assessment, basically a gas tax. You're laughing because Beth would say it wasn't a gas tax, it was a motor fuel assessment. It's a few cents, which was still on, I think we're still paid to do that, but that went into pay the debt service on those bonds. So those were special revenue bonds. They weren't GO bonds. Those were different than that. But at least Moody's was looking at it as net tax supported debt.
They were.
Yeah.
I'm hoping they wouldn't.
Yeah, not sure about the others, there's certain things we don't ask because then it'll, oh, wait a minute. So, but we know they were, so. And then just leases and some, they call subscription-based information technology arrangement, basically tech leases show up as net tax supported debt now as well. And this just shows the moral law. Mike talked a lot about that. But these are the issues, these are the authorities that have the ability to issue moral obligation bonds. And not everything, the bond bank, most everything the bond bank issues has the moral obligation on it. But there's also a state intercept too, which is kind of taking over instead of the moral law. But only certain bonds that VHFA and VITA issue are backed by the moral law. And the CDAC has a guideline to limit to about 200 to 225% of the state's net tax supported debt to be committed towards moral law. So you can see total commitment is about 1.1 million, even though there's only 820 million of outstanding moral law on books. And some of those VSAC is not using any. What do we do?
I think folks, yeah, some folks have it already electronically, so you can.
Thanks, Ashley. Have a good night.
Thank you.
The whole.
Sorry, I'll go quickly through the last few here. So, the next one, some of the additional considerations. Slide 22 here. So what we've covered so far is what the debt metrics that CDAC has traditionally looked at. Over the last couple of years, especially the rating agencies are looking more and more at the long-term liabilities, the pension and OPEB liabilities. And so CDAC is now considering that into their recommendations as well, even though they talked about maybe amending the statute because the statute mentioned certain metrics that to look at, but it was written a long time ago. It doesn't contemplate the pension and OPEB liabilities. So that's something that may make it more flexible, just to take into consideration. But this just shows you, this is Moody's ranking of the states where Vermont is in certain categories, basically between the pension and debt. And so the higher number is bad, like the state with the highest long-term liabilities is number one. So you'll see like the first line where it says ANPL, that stands for adjusted net pension liability as a percent of personal income. We're eighth highest in the country. And I know we talked about net pension liability adjusted. The rating agencies do their own adjustment. They take our net pension liability, and every state looks at their calculations a little bit differently. It depends, without getting too much into the weeds. There's a certain assumed rate of return on our investments, and we use 7%. Other states use different percentages, and so it affects what they call their liability. So the rating agencies say, okay, we're going to calculate everyone at 6%, so everybody's on the same level playing field, and that's why it's adjusted net pension liability. But this just shows the ranking. So the takeaway here is we're kind of high among the 50 states on long-term liabilities. And the next chart. Oh, sorry.
We have questions.
Yeah, I was
as well.
I'm sorry, chart are you looking at?
Page 23.
That was 22.
Okay, oh, you're on this, okay,
Sorry.
Scott doesn't mess with it.
yeah. It's getting that.
I know you guys are anxious to get out.
No.
No. So on 23, kind of the same thing. This just shows, rather than ranking, it just shows the numbers and where we rank among the AAA rated states, kind of up near the top. So again, the long-term liabilities, that's one of our, yeah. So, but again, we're addressing it. The next few charts, starting on page 24, this is an S&P chart, which shows your total debt and long-term liabilities as a percent of personal income. And you can see Vermont is, I don't know, what's that, eight or so in. And you can see the green is the amount of debt, which is very low. So when you're looking at our, when CDAC looks at the total, debt, that's a very small portion of what our, compared to the pension and OPEB liabilities. So you can see the blue in that brownish color, much higher numbers compared to the amount of outstanding debt that we have. 25, again, kind of tells you the same story. This is Moody's long-term liabilities as a percent of own source revenue. And when they say own source revenue, it's basically the state's revenues minus federal funding. So it's only from Vermont, kicks out the federal funding. And you can see it's, the long-term liability is 225% of the state's revenues. And you can see that the 50 state median is 131%. So we're pretty high. Yes.
Could you just convert that kind of to what that number would be, like 225%, what's the state's revenue that it brings in without the federal support?
Oh,
Mm.
yeah.
Okay.
I have that.
Could you get that answer for?
Yeah, that's a question for JFO as well.
Yeah, or F&M. Yeah, if I had the actor here, I could tell you, but I do not. So, yeah, but we can get that for you. So, oops.
So,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no trouble.
Lots of probes.
Yeah, we'll get that done.
On a curveball.
Better than a Friday afternoon.
Yeah. And then on the last one, 26, kind of the same thing. This is fixed costs, basically the same thing, your debt and your long-term liabilities. And they all show when you add in the pension and OPEB liabilities, we're kind of high among the 50 states.
Tell me what OPEB means again. I remember it and then it goes boom.
It's other post-employment benefits. So it's basically retiree healthcare. Which again, a few years ago, and Beth has always pushed to get the OPEB pre-funded. We are now in pre-funded status, which means years ago, that the health insurance, the OPEB for the teachers was actually paid out of the teachers' pension fund, which was a terrible thing to do. They got to the point where they created their own trust fund and kind of did a pay-go every year. So whatever the healthcare costs were, we paid it. We're now in a position to pre-fund it. So in addition to paying the cost for the year, we're paying the ADEC, basically the amount that the actuaries say you have to put in every year to get to full funding by 2048. The pensions are on 2038 deadline by statute. So those pensions, the pension funds, the teachers in the state will be fully funded by 2038, the OPEBs by 2048 in the current state. So it's,
The latter is being paid out of just general fund allotments as well.
the teachers has an ed fund portion as well. There's, for the liability, there's what it's broken up into normal cost and unfunded liability. And the normal cost is basically for active employees, like what it would cost to cover those people in retirement. And unfunded is basically what wasn't covered before, current retirees and the unfunded is the much bigger piece, but the ed fund is paying the normal cost pretty much.
Okay.
And the unfunded piece is coming from general. So the last slide is just the takeaways. Talked about the pension. CDAC recommends, paying the full ADEC for the VSERS and the teachers' pension funds and OPEB now that they're pre-funding. Continue to maintain the strong reserves, build the general fund balances. And the CAP fund is a big help. I know they're not considering that in a debt recommendation, but in order to, lower your amount of standing debt, converting, using more of the cash fund is a good thing. And again, the recommendation for 26, 27 is $100 million. So. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
I hope this helped the committee. We can always have the treasurer, state treasurer. State.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah.
This sets the groundwork. This is the first piece in terms of how the capital bill is put together. So the administration works within the confines of that 100 million over the 2 years. Doesn't mean the first year, FY 26, keep it at 50 million. It could be 40 million, could be 60 million. But that means in FY 27, if it's 60 million, you're only going to do 40 million in 27. So you don't have, you don't do split it 50-50. Brian.
So I can go pay attention to education testimony another time to learn about what they're going to do about school reconstruction, but if they should choose to do some state level bonding to pay for school replacement reconstruction, how does that affect with the stuff that we play with up here?
Well,
So so school funding used to be part of the capital.
We're on YouTube still.
So it used to be part of the capital bill. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's for
yeah.
you guys to figure out, but yeah.
Even if you do it through the bond bank, it's still gonna impact your moral obligation or your full faith and credit.
And your overall rating probably as it goes up.
Hmm?
And your overall rating, I assume.
We don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know. Depends how you structure it. The funding issue with our school construction has always been the issue.
Right,
Some folks don't want to take it out of the ed fund,
right,
though it is coming out of the ed fund, but it's not obvious. It's
Right.
there. Some folks don't want a dedicated revenue stream to pay for because they don't want to raise taxes. We have to be very conscious of the capital budget. I think there's what, $300 million of capital needs out there for our schools.
6 billion was the backlog that I heard. 300 times 20 years.
300
20 years,
times
over
10,
20 years.
1 year at a time, but it's 300 million. Our capital budget's only 50.
Yeah,
I mean, you can't even really give $1 million.
right.
So, that's the struggle. People always say, well, we gotta help schools, we gotta help districts with their school construction project. You gotta find where you're gonna fund it. And that's been,
And it's a much bigger policy conversation. Oh, I'm sure it'll go on forever, yeah. Yeah, literally like,
well, you
not
gotta,
just about bonding, it's like, yeah,
What do you-
how we run our school. Absolutely.
well, yeah, but it's also what's gonna be eligible for state dollars.
Yeah.
What's gonna be eligible. Because under the old system, there was a process to figure out what part of that project would be eligible for state dollars. It wasn't the whole project.
Right. Yeah, those conversations were already happening last year too, so, yeah.
Yeah, and we lived it in here.
Yeah.
We lived it. In the old days, most people here have not lived it. I think Wanda and I are the only ones left.
Wanda.
Yeah, Wanda did.
Oh, Wanda. No.
Wanda Manoli.
Yeah.
She was with school construction before she moved over to BTS.
Ours was the last school that got.
Yeah, Bennington.
And now you
The
want to
middle.
pay for your money.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing theme today, all these monies that go to Bennington.
We're gonna go up. We're done for the day. We're back